Hello friends, my name is the real Emile and welcome to a brand new episode of the Forza Top Gear Lap Series. This week's theme was random C-Class cars, and let's get into it with the first car today, which is the BMW X6M, 567 horsepower, 5,185 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today, it's also the heaviest. Now, we've had the BMW X5M go around before, and I still say that that is one of the best, most surprising cars I ever took around this track, because instead of handling like a big SUV, it handled like a Subaru Impreza almost. The X6 was, well, not that. I was hoping that maybe this thing would be much the same as the X5, but no, this vehicle feels a lot more heavier than the X5, it understeers a lot more, it rolls a bit more through the corners, however it is quicker. 567 horsepower is a ridiculous amount of power. To put that into perspective, that's more than a Ferrari 458 Italia. You know, that's more than a bona fide supercar. And it's in this SUV. Now, yeah, putting that much power for an SUV might not be the most sensible thing in the world. It isn't a terrible handling car by any stretch of the imagination, it just isn't nowhere near as good as the X5M, and indeed most of the SUVs in this game are a much better choice than the X6, so that's what I'd recommend doing personally. I'd recommend going for the X5 or the Range Rover SVR, for example. Anyways, next up we have a Australian hero, which is kind of interesting considering Forza Horizon 3 has been announced this week and that's set in Australia. Anyways, this is the HSV GTS, 457 horsepower, 4,068 pounds of weight. Now, this car is kind of comparable to the Chrysler 300C and the Chevrolet SS. They would be its main rivals. Unlike those two cars though, I think this is slightly better to drive. It's still a complete handful. This is a muscle car, you know, by definition. It's quite heavy, it wants to slide all the time, and it's very, very quick. 437 horsepower means this is the second most powerful car here today. My god, does it feel it. This thing is very quick, it pulls like a train. Between the 300C, the SS, and this, I would probably go with the 300C, as I believe it's a little bit cheaper than the HSV. However, the HSV certainly isn't a bad car. Still, there's plenty of muscle cars on offer, and for not much more money than this, you could get, say, a Shelby GT350R, which is a much better handling vehicle, so that's probably what I would recommend you end up going with. Anyways, next up we have the Chevrolet Camaro 35th Anniversary Edition, 325 horsepower, 3,554 pounds of weight. Now, a couple of weeks ago we had the Pontiac Firebird WS6 go around the track. And the WS6 is actually, I believe, based on the Camaro platform. It uses many of the same panels. I believe the Firebird's like a crossbreed of a Camaro and a Corvette. Anyways, so the Camaro had quite a lot to stand up to, of course. You know, it's got the Firebird as its twin, essentially. And I was curious to see how the Camaro would handle compared to the Firebird. And, well, the Camaro is fantastic. This really is a very good handling car. Not quite as good as the Firebird. This is a little bit more slideways than the Firebird. However, it might be a little bit quicker in a straight line. I don't know, something about this not having the ram air hood may make it a little bit more aerodynamic. Yeah, the Camaro is excellent. It really is an extremely quick car. I'm not even a huge fan of Chevrolet Camaros. I don't really like them. However, I've got to admit, this car handles brilliantly. There's something about these sort of late 90s, early 2000s Chevrolets in this game, which just, they handle great for some odd reason. But yeah, definitely give the Camaro a go, this is a great car. Next up we have the Maserati Ghibli Cup 1997, 326 horsepower, 3,009 pounds. Now, the Ghibli, whatever you want to call it, we've had the newer version of this car go around before. It's actually a four-wheel drive sports sedan. However, this was back when it was a rear-wheel drive sports coupe, I guess you could call it. Long story short, I do not like the way this car drives. It is quite slidey, as in it's a lot more slidey than I would personally like it to be. I've always kind of liked the Ghibli. It's a very strange looking car. It kind of honestly looks like a Buick Regal from like the 1980s from some angles. It's a very American looking car, which is kind of strange considering, you know, it's an Italian car. Then again, of course, Maserati and I believe it was Cadillac had a bit of a business relationship in the 90s, so I don't know if this was related to that at all. But anyways, yeah, the Ghibli just isn't a particularly good handling car. It is pretty darn quick. 326 horsepower is a decent amount. It doesn't weigh all that much either. I believe, yeah, actually, it is the second lightest car, oh sorry, the third lightest car here today. But ultimately, I just don't really like the way this vehicle drives particularly. There are better sports coupes on offer. Next up, we have the Audi RS2 Avant, 3,517 pounds, 311 horsepower. Now, the RS2 is the one of two four-wheel drive cars here today, obviously the X6 being the other one. And the RS2, in my opinion, was better to drive than the X6. I will say the RS2, it's a little bit understeery for my liking. However, it is essentially what you would expect from a four-wheel drive car. You get that bit of understeer, you get good launch off the line, you get reasonably decent speed through the corners, you know, it doesn't oversteer or anything. Power is respectable, 311 horsepower isn't a lot, but it still isn't too bad for this vehicle, especially a wagon from the 90s. It definitely isn't bad. And while it may not be quite as quick, I would probably take the RS2 over, say, an E36 or a car like this from its generation. The RS2, of course, was one of the first sports wagons, and people really seem to like the RS2. And to be honest with you, I kind of like the RS2 too. It's a cool looking car. Yeah, not a bad car to drive overall. Could be better. I have definitely driven better vehicles than the RS2, but it certainly wasn't terrible by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, pretty good car overall. Next up, we have the Pontiac Solstice GXP, 260 horsepower, 3,018 pounds of weight. The Pontiac Solstice is a sports car, rear-wheel drive, front-engined, and I wasn't really expecting much from the Solstice. I've never been a huge fan of this car. Sure, it looks decent enough. It's kind of goofy looking. To be honest with you, it actually kind of reminds me of a Toyota Mark IV Supra. In the sense that it's got that raised back end. It looks a little goofy from certain angles. Of course, the Mark IV Supra is much more well known and much more liked than the Solstice, but still. Anyways, how is this vehicle when it comes to driving? Well, it is the third least powerful car here today. However, it is extremely neutral. I've spoke about neutral driving cars much more in these last few weeks. Essentially what I mean by a neutral handling car is it feels very natural to drive. The tail may occasionally come out on this, you know, it's not a perfect handling car, but when the tail comes out, you know, it's kind of easy to correct. It's nice. It's a nice car to drive, the Solstice. It's essentially kind of feels like a more powerful, heavier Miata, essentially. That's sort of the vibe I get from this vehicle. Yeah, the Solstice was surprisingly good and beat my expectations. Next up, we have the Dodge Neon SRT4, 230 horsepower, 2,984 pounds. This is the least powerful vehicle here today. Now, the Dodge Neon is a bit of a running joke. Everyone who knows about cars knows that the Neon is a little bit of a joke, and especially the SRT4. While it may have not been the worst vehicle when it first came out, it certainly is not a particularly well-respected vehicle, and, well, if you're going to crap talk a car, the Neon is probably a good place to start. However, the Dodge Neon to drive, it's very hot hatch-esque. This is one of those cars which I've kind of wanted to do for a good couple of months now, because I've always wanted to put it in the hot hatch episodes, but I don't quite think it's really a hot hatch, like it's more of a sedan than a hot hatch, but nevertheless, it does definitely drive like one. 230 horsepower isn't all that much from a hot hatch. However, I will say this is one of the better handling ones. It also isn't exactly a slouch in a straight line. Of course, you know, hot hatches of today, they have upwards of 300 horsepower, so competing in a straight line for the SRT4 might be a bit tricky. However, it's certainly not a bad car to drive, this thing. I would compare it more towards the Renault Megane RS250 that we had out a good couple of weeks ago, in the sense that it's quite understeery, but it isn't the worst thing in the world. And finally today we have the Mercedes-Benz 190E Evolution 2, 235 horsepower, 2,954 pounds of weight. Despite being a four-door saloon car, this is the lightest vehicle here today. However, it isn't far off being the least powerful, with only 235 horsepower, only minorly winning its power bout to the Neon. Anyways, the 190E, of course, this car is a touring car legend, originally built for Group B rallying, and then of course transitioned into DTM. This thing it's a pretty well liked car, the 190E. It definitely has a legacy behind it, and well, to drive it is pretty good. I really like the way the 190E drives. It's very downforce-esque. This car stays very, very planted. Admittedly, with 235 horsepower, it's not exactly like the back wheels are going to break traction with that much power, at least if the car's well balanced. Of course, if it isn't, then it's a possibility. But yeah, it is a great driving vehicle. Not the quickest car in the world, certainly. This is actually probably the slowest car in a straight line here today. Of course, not helped by that massive wing on the back. But I did enjoy my time with the 190E. It is a pretty good vehicle to drive, it looks great, and yeah, cool car. Anyways, let's move on to the times, and the fastest car of today was the Chevrolet Camaro, going into 144th with a 123.962, and the HSV goes into 149th with a 124.140. That Camaro is ridiculously quick. That's quicker than some B-class cars around this track. That was insane, and the HSV certainly isn't bad either. Next up we have the BMW X6M, 173rd with a 125.615, beating out an 037 Stradale minorly. The Ghibli goes into 176 with a 125.856, minorly beats out an Evo 8. Then again, that Evo 8 was one of the first cars to ever go around this track. Not a particularly great time from either of those cars, to be honest with you. The RS2 Avant goes into 185th with a 126.441, beats out a Golf R, which is quite surprising. Mark II Focus RS beats out the Pontiac Firebird as well. Yeah, that's a damn respectable time from that RS2. Next up, we have the Pontiac Solstice going into 194th with a 127.103, a little bit slower than an S2000, a little bit quicker than an Evo 9. And the Mercedes-Benz 190E Evolution 2 goes into 202nd with a 127.631. A little bit quicker than a Coupe GP. Again, Coupe GP was one of the first cars to go around this track. Unfortunately, that car just didn't have the straight line speed. And finally today, the Dodge Neon SRT4 goes into 206 with a 127.859. It does beat out a Renault Megane RS250 fractionally. It's in between the Astra and the Megane, and I think that's really where that car should sit. And that's quite surprising a time, considering that, you know, those cars have, well, the Megane has 20 more horsepower than the Neon. The Astra has 50 more horsepower than the Neon, 56 more horsepower. So that's pretty damn good. Anyways, friends, that is it for today's episode of the Forza Top Gear Laps. Next week, we're going to be finishing up the random series with a look at random D-Class cars, so hopefully you join me for that. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. My name's been The Real Emile, and until next time, farewell.